Ethan was only 11 years old, but he carried the weight of someone much older, abandoned by his parents. He had learned to survive on the unforgiving streets of the city. But unlike many who found themselves lost in the chaos of the streets, Ethan had two reasons to keep fighting. Jake, who was just 6, and Max, who had recently turned 8. These two boys had become his family, not by blood, but by the shared hardship they endured together. Their home was a fragile cardboard box tucked away in a corner of an alley, given to them by some nearby shops who took pity on them. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Ethan tried his best to keep it clean and organized, despite the odds stacked against them. Every night, he would tuck Jake and Max into their makeshift bed, using torn blankets they had found as the cold city air cut through their thin clothes. Ethan would always stay awake a little longer, watching the streets, thinking about how their lives could have been different if their parents hadn't left them behind. During the day, Ethan would venture out into the city, hoping to scavenge food or collect spare change from passersby. He was the oldest, and he felt responsible for making sure Jake and Max didn't go hungry. Though they were young, both Jake and Max understood the tough reality of their lives, and they never complained. Still, Ethan couldn't help but feel the pressure of being their protector. Every time he left them to go find food, he worried that something might happen in his absence. The streets were harsh, full of people who barely noticed the three boys struggling to survive. But Ethan never let bitterness take over his heart. He believed that there was still good in the world, even if it was hard to find. He had a fierce determination to stay kind, to never let the streets make him cruel. Some nights, though, the weight of it all would press on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He would look at his two brothers, sleeping soundly, and promise himself that he would never stop fighting for them. One evening, as the sun was setting and the streets began to empty, Ethan sat on the edge of the plaza, watching people hurry past him. Jake and Max were asleep in the cardboard house, and Ethan had decided to take a short break before returning. As he stared into the distance, he suddenly noticed an older man stumbling in the square, his hand clutching his chest. The man looked to be in pain, his face contorted as he struggled to stay on his feet. Without thinking, Ethan jumped up and ran toward him. "Sir, are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling as he reached the man who had collapsed on the ground by now. The man didn't respond, his breathing ragged and his face pale. Panic surged through Ethan. He was just a boy. He had no idea how to help someone in a medical emergency. But he couldn't just leave the man there. Desperately looking around for help, Ethan spotted a police patrol car in the distance. Summoning all the courage he had, he waved his arms frantically and shouted, "Help! Over here! Someone's hurt!" His voice cracked, but he kept shouting until the officers noticed him and drove over. The officers jumped out of their car and rushed to the man's side, immediately realizing the severity of the situation. "He's having a heart attack," one of them said, kneeling down beside the man. They acted fast, calling for an ambulance while another officer checked the man's pulse. Ethan stood back, watching everything unfold, his heart racing. He didn't know what else to do, but he hoped that his actions had helped. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics swiftly moved the elderly man onto a stretcher, taking him to the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens blared in the distance, Ethan found himself alone again in the quiet plaza. The city seemed even more silent than usual, the cold wind whipping through the empty streets. Ethan let out a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and fear. He had done what he could to help the man, but now he was back in the reality of his own harsh world. He slowly made his way back to Jake and Max, who were still sleeping peacefully in their cardboard shelter. The small moment of hope he had felt earlier quickly faded, and the weight of their situation came crashing back down on him. Winter was approaching, and Ethan knew that their fragile cardboard home wouldn't survive the cold winds or heavy rains. He lay down beside his brothers, pulling the thin blankets over all of them, and closed his eyes. The sound of the city seemed far away now, and for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to dream of a life where they didn't have to struggle so much just to survive. The days after the heart attack incident passed by slowly, Ethan continued his daily struggle, collecting what little he could for himself and his brothers. Winter was growing near, and the cold seemed to cut deeper with each passing day. His cardboard home, which had once provided some sense of safety, now felt like a fragile shield against the harsh weather that loomed ahead. He spent most of his time thinking about how he could protect Jake and Max from the freezing nights that were sure to come. One particular evening, as the sun began to disappear behind the buildings, Ethan found himself sitting on the same bench near the plaza where everything had happened. The memory of helping the old man was still fresh in his mind, but he hadn't seen any sign of the man since that night. Maybe he was still in the hospital. Maybe he hadn't survived. Ethan shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. He had more immediate concerns to worry about, like where they would find food tonight, or how to keep Jake and Max warm when the temperatures dropped even lower. As he sat there, lost in thought, a car pulled up near the bench. It wasn't the usual kind of car you'd see in this part of the city. It was sleek black and obviously expensive. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise as the door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out. Ethan barely recognized him at first, but as the man walked closer, it hit him. This was the same old man he had helped in the plaza, but he looked different now. His face was no longer twisted in pain, and he moved with confidence and strength. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and confusion wash over him. "You're the boy from that night, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Ethan nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "I've been looking for you," the man continued. "I owe you a great deal. You saved my life." Ethan didn't know how to respond. No one had ever thanked him for anything before, let alone told him that he had saved their life. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, unsure of what was happening. I just called for help," Ethan mumbled, his eyes darting toward the ground. "I didn't really do anything." The man, now standing directly in front of Ethan, shook his head. "You did more than that. Without you, I might not be here right now." He sat down beside Ethan on the bench, his eyes softening. "My name is Oliver. I'm the governor of this city." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The governor? He had helped the governor? His mind raced as he tried to process what this meant. Why would someone so important be in the plaza that night? And why was he here now, talking to him of all people? Oliver seemed to sense Ethan's confusion. "I was on my way home that night when the heart attack happened," he explained. "I've been recovering for a few days, but I couldn't stop thinking about the boy who saved me. I wanted to find you, to thank you personally." He paused for a moment, studying Ethan carefully. "Tell me, where are your parents?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He hadn't thought about his parents in a long time. They had left him behind so long ago that the memories of them had become distant, blurry, but the pain of abandonment was still fresh. He hesitated before answering, not sure how much to reveal. "I don't have any," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Oliver's expression softened even more. "And those two boys you're always with? They're your brothers?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really. We're not related, but they're all I've got. I take care of them." The governor sat silently for a few moments, as if absorbing everything Ethan had just said. "You're a brave boy, Ethan," he finally said. "Most kids your age would have run away from a situation like that, but you stayed. You helped. That says a lot about who you are." Ethan felt his face flush with embarrassment. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone like the governor. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his eyes still fixed on the ground. Oliver took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something important. "Look, I don't usually do this, but I feel like I owe you more than just words. I know life out here on the streets is hard, especially with winter coming. I want to help you. I want to help you and those boys." Ethan's heart raced. Help? Real help? The kind that could actually change something? He wasn't sure if he should believe it. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I run a program," Oliver explained. "A center where kids like you can stay. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's food. You won't have to worry about freezing on the streets anymore. You and your brothers can come stay there for as long as you need." Ethan's mind was spinning. A warm place to stay? Food? Safety? It sounded too good to be true, but a small voice in the back of his head warned him to be careful. He had learned not to trust promises so easily. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. Oliver nodded. "I know it's hard to trust people after everything you've been through, but I'm offering you a chance to change things for the better. You don't have to accept it right now. Think about it, but I'll be here again tomorrow, and if you decide you want to come, I'll take you and your brothers there myself." Ethan didn't know what to say. The offer seemed like a lifeline, something he had been waiting for but never thought would come. But at the same time, the fear of losing what little control he had over his life kept him silent. Could he really trust this man? Could he risk it for Jake and Max? Oliver stood up, giving Ethan one last kind look. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said before getting back into his car and driving away, leaving Ethan alone on the bench once again. Winter arrived with a vengeance, and the cold became almost unbearable. Ethan could feel the icy wind cutting through his worn-out clothes as he huddled with Jake and Max inside their fragile cardboard home. The small structure that had once given them a sense of security now felt like a trap, unable to protect them from the brutal weather. Each night, the boys would pile whatever scraps of fabric they could find over themselves, hoping it would be enough to keep the cold at bay, but deep down, Ethan knew it wouldn't be. Every morning, he would wake up early, check on Jake and Max to make sure they hadn't gotten sick, and then venture out into the city in search of food or some kind of shelter. But with each passing day, the streets became emptier as the cold forced people to stay indoors. The few who did pass by hurried along, their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the desperate eyes of the street kids. Ethan tried not to let the hopelessness get to him, but the biting cold and the growling hunger in his stomach made it harder and harder to stay positive. One day, as the wind howled through the alley where their cardboard home was located, Ethan realized that they wouldn't survive the winter like this. The cardboard was already soggy from the constant drizzle, and if a real storm came, it would collapse completely. Ethan sat quietly, thinking about the offer the Governor Oliver had made. A warm place to stay, food, safety. It sounded too good to be true, but what other choice did he have? If they stayed on the streets, he knew he wouldn't be able to protect Jake and Max much longer. As Ethan sat on the cold ground, watching his younger brothers sleep, he felt the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. They depended on him for everything. If he made the wrong decision, it wouldn't just affect him, it would affect all of them. His mind raced with questions. Could they trust Oliver? Would they be safe in his center? What if it was a trick? But then he thought about the cold, the hunger, and the fear in Jake and Max's eyes every time the wind howled outside. The truth was, they didn't have much of a choice. The next morning, Ethan made his way back to the plaza where he had met Oliver. He sat on the same bench, hoping the governor would show up again as he had promised. The cold wind whipped through his clothes, making him shiver uncontrollably, but he stayed put, determined to at least hear Oliver out one more time. After what felt like hours, the sleek black car appeared again, pulling up slowly to the edge of the plaza. Oliver stepped out, just as composed as before, his coat wrapped tightly around him to block the cold. When he saw Ethan, he smiled warmly, as if he knew the boy would return. "I'm glad you came," Oliver said, walking over and sitting beside Ethan. "I know you must have thought about my offer." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the ground as he struggled to find the right words. "It's been really cold," he admitted softly. "Our place, it's not going to hold up much longer." Oliver listened intently, his expression full of understanding. "I can only imagine how hard it's been for you and your brothers. No one should have to live like that, especially not kids. That's why I want to help you." Ethan looked up at Oliver, searching his face for any sign of deception, but all he saw was kindness. The same kindness he had seen that night when Oliver had thanked him for saving his life. "You really mean it?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with doubt. "You'll let us stay at your center?" Oliver nodded firmly. "Yes. I've already made arrangements for you, Jake and Max. There's a place for you there, warm beds, food, and people who can help. All you have to do is say yes." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. But still, there was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of trusting someone, fear of losing control. He glanced back toward the alley where his brothers were still hiding, then back at Oliver. What if they don't want us there? What if something goes wrong? Oliver placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Nothing will go wrong, I promise you. I've seen how strong you are, how much you care for your brothers. That's the kind of determination we need in the world. And at the center, you'll have the chance to get back on your feet, to give your brothers the life they deserve." Ethan swallowed hard. The idea of having a roof over their heads, food in their stomachs, and a place to sleep without fearing the cold sounded like a dream. He didn't want to make the decision out of desperation, but deep down, he knew this was the best chance they had. "Okay," Ethan whispered, barely able to hear his own voice. "We'll come." Oliver smiled warmly, standing up and extending a hand to Ethan. "Good. I'll take you there myself." Ethan hesitated for a moment before reaching out and taking Oliver's hand. It felt strange, trusting someone after all the time he had spent fending for himself and his brothers. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they walked back to the alley where Jake and Max were waiting, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Could this really be the start of something better? Would they finally have a place to call home? The wind continued to bite at his skin, but the thought of warmth, safety, and the future ahead made it just a little more bearable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. As the winter days dragged on, Ethan, Jake, and Max began to settle into their new reality at the center. The warmth of the building, the soft beds, and the regular meals were luxuries they hadn't known in a long time. For Ethan, it felt like a dream, surreal and almost too good to be true. But the kindness of Oliver, the governor who had taken them in, seemed genuine. Slowly, the boys started to let their guard down. Jake and Max, in particular, thrived in the new environment, their energy returning as they no longer had to worry about where their next meal would come from. For Ethan, however, things weren't so simple. While he was grateful for the safety and security of the center, a part of him struggled to adjust to this new life. For so long, he had been the one in charge, the protector of Jake and Max. Now, with the staff at the center taking care of the boys, Ethan felt his role shifting, and it left him uneasy. What was his purpose here? He had spent so many years focused on survival that he didn't know how to relax, how to live without the constant worry that had shaped his existence. One afternoon, while the boys were busy playing in the courtyard, Oliver arrived for a visit. It had been a few weeks since Ethan had last seen him, and the governor's presence was a welcome sight. Ethan greeted him with a small smile, though he still felt a sense of uncertainty around the man. After all, people in power had never cared for kids like him before. "How are things going here, Ethan?" Oliver asked, his voice as warm and calm as ever. Ethan shrugged, looking around the courtyard. It's different," he admitted. "Better than the streets, for sure. Jake and Max love it here." Oliver smiled, his eyes following the younger boys as they ran around, laughing and playing without a care in the world. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "Are you settling in?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain the conflict brewing inside him. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I'm just not used to all this. For so long, it was just about surviving. Now, it's different. I don't know what to do anymore." Oliver nodded thoughtfully, taking a seat on the bench next to Ethan. "It's not easy, is it? When you spend so much time fighting to survive, it's hard to stop and let yourself feel safe." "I understand, Ethan. You've taken care of your brothers for so long that it's hard to let anyone else help. Ethan looked up at Oliver, surprised by how well the man seemed to understand what he was going through. Yeah, Ethan muttered, kicking at a loose stone on the ground. It's weird not having to worry about everything all the time, but I don't want to lose, I don't know, control, I guess. Oliver leaned forward, his tone serious but kind. Ethan, you're not losing control. You're just adjusting to a new reality, and that takes time. You've been through more than most adults could handle, and you did it all to protect your brothers. That's not something that just goes away overnight. But now, you don't have to do it all alone. You've got help. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much the constant pressure had weighed on him until now. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one looking out for Jake and Max. But the thought of relying on others still made him uneasy. What if something goes wrong? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if they take this away? Oliver placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. I won't let that happen, Ethan. You and your brothers are safe here. And if there's ever a problem, I'll be here to help you through it. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Ethan wanted to believe him, but the fear of losing everything again was hard to shake. He had seen how quickly things could change, how easily people could abandon you when you needed them most. Still, there was something about Oliver that made Ethan want to trust him. Maybe it was the fact that the governor had kept his promise, had come back to check on them even after they were safely in the center. As the conversation continued, Oliver told Ethan more about the center and how it had been created to help kids like him, kids who had been abandoned or who had no one else to turn to. Ethan listened carefully, realizing that there were others like him out there. Kids who had faced the same struggles, who had been forced to grow up too fast. The idea that he wasn't alone in this was both comforting and overwhelming. Before Oliver left that day, he pulled Ethan aside one last time. I see a lot of potential in you, Ethan, he said, his voice firm but kind. You've got a good heart, and you're stronger than you realize. This isn't just a place for you to survive. It's a place for you to grow, to figure out what you want to do with your life. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. No one had ever talked to him like that before, like he was someone who mattered, someone with a future. As he watched Oliver walk away, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. That night, as he lay in bed, listening to Jake and Max's steady breathing beside him, Ethan stared up at the ceiling and thought about the future. It was a concept he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time, but now it seemed within reach. The streets had been his reality for so long, but maybe this new life at the center could be the start of something better, for him and for his brothers. Ethan never thought he'd say it, but life at the center was becoming more comfortable than he had ever imagined. Weeks had passed since he and his brothers arrived, and the warmth of safety was slowly replacing the cold uncertainty that had once dominated his days. Jake and Max were thriving. They played with the other kids, ate full meals, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan could see smiles on their faces that weren't shadowed by fear or hunger. It was a strange thing to see them so carefree, and although Ethan still carried the burden of their survival, he couldn't deny that the center had given them something precious: hope. Still, a part of Ethan found it hard to adjust. The streets had been his life for so long that he didn't know how to relax in this new environment. There were no more late nights spent worrying if they would make it through another freezing evening, no more scavenging for food, no more fearing the unknown dangers lurking in the shadows. But with that, there was also a sense of loss. He had always been the one in charge, the protector. Now, with the staff at the center taking on many of those responsibilities, Ethan felt his role shifting in ways that left him unsure of who he was supposed to be. One day, while sitting on the steps outside the main building, Ethan noticed Oliver walking up the pathway. The governor had been visiting regularly since they arrived, checking in on Ethan and his brothers. always making sure they were well taken care of. But today, Oliver had a different look in his eyes, one of determination mixed with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Oliver sat down next to Ethan, his expression softening as he looked at the boy. "I've been watching you, Ethan," he said, his voice calm but serious. "And I see how much you care about Jake and Max. You've done an incredible job looking out for them, even when you didn't have much to give. But now that you're here, I want to talk to you about something more." Ethan frowned slightly, unsure of what Oliver meant. "What do you mean more?" Oliver took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think you've got a lot of potential, Ethan. You're smart, you're responsible, and most importantly, you have a good heart. Those aren't qualities that come easily, especially not for someone who's been through what you have. But I think there's more for you than just surviving. I want you to start thinking about what kind of future you want." The idea of thinking about the future was foreign to Ethan. For as long as he could remember, his only goal had been getting through the day. The concept of having dreams, of planning for something bigger than tomorrow, felt distant, like something that belonged to other people. "I don't know what kind of future I could have," Ethan admitted, looking down at his hands. "I've never really thought about it." Oliver nodded, understanding the boy's hesitation. "I know it's hard to imagine when you've spent so long just trying to make it from one day to the next. But you're not on the streets anymore, Ethan. You have options now. And I think it's time you start thinking about what you want to do with your life. Not just for Jake and Max, but for yourself." Ethan was silent for a long moment, the weight of Oliver's words sinking in. No one had ever asked him what he wanted for his future before. It had always been about survival, about protecting his brothers. But now, sitting here with Oliver, the possibility of having a life beyond the streets didn't seem so far-fetched. Still, there was doubt. Could he really dream of something more? Did he deserve it? "What if I don't know what I want?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I mess it up?" Oliver smiled gently, his gaze steady. "No one expects you to have all the answers right now, Ethan. Figuring out what you want takes time. But you don't have to do it alone. There are people here who can help you, guide you. And as for messing up, well, that's part of life. The important thing is that you're willing to try, to take that first step towards something better." Ethan nodded slowly, though his mind was still swirling with uncertainty. He had spent so long being the caretaker, the one who kept everything together. But now that they were safe, he realized he didn't know who he was outside of that role. What did he want for himself? The question lingered in his mind long after Oliver left. Over the next few days, Ethan started to notice changes in the way he saw things. He watched Jake and Max playing with the other kids, running around without a care in the world, and he realized that for the first time, they had a chance at a real childhood. And maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at something too. But figuring out what that was still felt like a daunting task. How do you dream when you've never been allowed to before? It wasn't until a few weeks later that Ethan's path became a little clearer. One afternoon, as he was helping the staff clean up after lunch, one of the workers, a woman named Clara, asked him if he had ever thought about going back to school. "I see how you look after your brothers," she said kindly. "You're smart, Ethan. I bet you do really well in school." Ethan shook his head. "I haven't been to school in years. I don't even know if I could catch up." Clara smiled. "You'd be surprised how quickly you can pick things up when you're determined. And I think you've got more determination than most people." The idea of going back to school hadn't even crossed Ethan's mind. School had always seemed like something that belonged to other kids, the ones who had parents and homes, the ones who didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. But now, with the stability of the center, maybe it was something he could consider. That night, Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling as Jake and Max slept soundly beside him. School, the thought of sitting in a classroom again, of learning, of being part of something normal, was both terrifying and exciting. Could he really do it? Could he go back to being a regular kid after everything he'd been through? The next day, Ethan found Oliver in his office, He stood nervously at the door for a moment before finally knocking. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Oliver looked up from his desk, smiling warmly. "Of course, Ethan. Come in." Ethan stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the future." Oliver leaned back in his chair, nodding encouragingly. "And I think I want to try going back to school," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but I want to try." Oliver's smile widened and he stood up, crossing the room to place a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That's a big step, Ethan, and I think it's the right one. You don't have to worry about being perfect. The fact that you're willing to try is what matters most." As Ethan left Oliver's office that day, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope for the future. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. Ethan's decision to go back to school marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. For the first time, he wasn't just focused on survival. He was thinking about his future. The center staff had worked hard to get him enrolled in a nearby school, and although the idea of sitting in a classroom again made him anxious, it also filled him with a sense of purpose. Jake and Max were thrilled for him, even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. To them, the idea of Ethan going to school was exciting, another step toward the normal life they had all longed for. On his first day back, Ethan stood outside the school gates, feeling the weight of nerves settle in his stomach. It had been years since he had set foot in a classroom, and the fear of not fitting in, of being too far behind, gnawed at him. The kids walking past him seemed carefree, their lives so different from the one he had known. They didn't know what it was like to sleep in the cold, to worry about where their next meal would come from. Ethan took a deep breath and reminded himself that this was a chance to start fresh. As he walked through the halls, everything felt foreign. The sound of lockers clanking shut, the murmur of voices echoing off the walls. It was overwhelming at first, but then he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just about him. It was about Jake and Max, about giving them a future where they wouldn't have to face the same struggles he did. With that thought in mind, Ethan pushed forward, determined to make the most of this opportunity. The first few weeks were tough. Ethan quickly realized how much he had missed. His classmates had been learning for years, while he had been fighting to survive on the streets. The gap in knowledge felt insurmountable at times, and there were moments when he wanted to give up, convinced he would never catch up. But every time that doubt crept in, he thought of Jake and Max. He thought of Oliver, who had believed in him when no one else had. And slowly, with the help of his teachers and the staff at the center, Ethan started to find his footing. One afternoon, as Ethan was working on a math assignment in the library, Clara, one of the center's staff members, approached him. "How's school going?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Ethan shrugged, not looking up from his notebook. "It's hard. I'm really behind, and sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, I won't be able to catch up." Clara smiled sympathetically. "It's normal to feel that way when you're adjusting to something new. But you're doing better than you think, Ethan. I've seen how determined you are. You've already overcome so much. Don't underestimate what you're capable of." Ethan appreciated her words, but it was still hard to shake the feeling of being out of place. He wasn't like the other kids in his class. Their lives seemed easy compared to his, and even though he was trying to move forward, his past was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. Still, he wasn't about to give up. The street life had taught him resilience, and if he had survived that, he could survive school too. As the months went by, Ethan began to make progress. Slowly but surely, the lessons started to make sense, and his confidence grew. He found himself staying late after class to get extra help from his teachers, determined to make up for lost time. He even started making friends, something he hadn't expected. There were a few kids who, like him, had faced difficult circumstances, and they bonded over their shared experiences. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't so alone. Back at the center, life continued to improve for Jake and Max as well. The stability of having a safe place to sleep and regular meals had allowed them to thrive. Jake, always full of energy, had become the favorite of the staff, constantly running around and making everyone laugh. Max, quieter and more introspective, spent his days reading and drawing, his creative side flourishing in the calm environment. Watching them grow and enjoy life made everything Ethan was going through at school worth it. He had promised to protect them, and now he was keeping that promise in a way he hadn't thought possible. One evening, as they were sitting around the dinner table at the center, Oliver paid them another visit. The boys greeted him eagerly, always excited to see the man who had changed their lives. After dinner, Oliver pulled Ethan aside for a private conversation. "I've been hearing good things about you," Oliver said with a smile. "Your teachers say you've been working hard, and the staff here tell me you're settling in well. I'm proud of you, Ethan." Ethan felt a surge of pride at Oliver's words, but there was still a lingering doubt in his mind. I don't know if I'm doing as well as they say," he admitted. "I'm still behind in a lot of things, and sometimes it feels like I'm never going to catch up." Oliver's expression softened. "Ethan, you've already achieved more than you realize. The fact that you're here in school, working hard every day, that's something a lot of people wouldn't have the strength to do. You've been through things most kids your age can't even imagine, and you've come out stronger because of it. Don't be so hard on yourself." Ethan nodded, though the doubt still lingered. He had come a long way, but there was still so much more to do. "What if I'm not enough?" he asked quietly, the fear that had been eating away at him finally surfacing. "What if I never get to where I need to be?" Oliver placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his voice steady and reassuring. "You are enough, Ethan. You've always been enough. It's not about where you are right now. It's about the direction you're moving in. And from where I'm standing, you're on the right path." Those words stuck with Ethan long after their conversation ended. He had spent so much of his life feeling like he wasn't good enough, like he had to prove his worth just to survive. But Oliver's belief in him, combined with the progress he was making in school, started to chip away at those old fears. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was growing, learning, and becoming someone he had never imagined he could be. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to push himself. He studied harder than ever, determined to prove that he belonged in school, that he could have a future beyond the streets. And as he did, something unexpected happened. He started to dream. It was a small, tentative thing at first, but it grew as the days passed. He began to imagine a life where he wasn't just surviving day by day, but thriving. A life where he could provide for Jake and Max, where they could all be happy, safe, and free. Ethan didn't know exactly what his future would look like yet, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it could be bright. He wasn't just a street kid anymore. He was a student, a brother, and maybe, just maybe, someone with a future full of possibilities. As the months rolled on, Ethan's life continued to change in ways he never imagined. School had become part of his daily routine, and he was finally starting to feel like he belonged there. The initial fear and anxiety that had clouded his mind during those first days were slowly being replaced by a growing confidence. His teachers noticed his determination and gave him extra support, which helped him bridge the gap he feared would be impossible to close. And though he was still playing catch-up in some subjects, Ethan was no longer afraid of failure. He had learned that progress, no matter how small, was still progress. Meanwhile, back at the center, Jake and Max had flourished. They had fully adapted to their new lives, and the carefree joy that had once been buried beneath layers of fear was now visible in their smiles. Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride when he looked at them. This was what he had always wanted for them: stability, safety, a chance to be kids. The weight of protecting them was no longer crushing him, and he could finally see the light at the end of a tunnel that had once seemed endless. One evening, after a long day at school, Ethan sat on the front steps of the center, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, casting a soft glow over the courtyard. As he sat there, lost in thought, Oliver approached and sat down beside him. It had become a regular occurrence for the two of them to talk in the evenings, reflecting on everything that had changed since Ethan and his brothers arrived. "You've come a long way, Ethan," Oliver said, his tone filled with pride. "I remember the first time I met you, sitting on that bench, unsure of what the future would hold. And now look at you." Ethan smiled faintly, thinking back to that moment in the plaza. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Yeah, things have changed a lot," he admitted. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." Oliver nodded. "It's real, Ethan. You've worked hard to get here, and you should be proud of yourself. But there's something else I wanted to talk to you about." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Oliver turned slightly to face him, his expression serious but kind. "I've been thinking about your future, Ethan. You've made incredible progress here, and I don't want that to stop. I want to give you the chance to do something more, something that can set you up for a life beyond what you thought possible." Ethan's heart raced at Oliver's words. "What do you mean?" "I've talked to some people," Oliver explained, "and I've secured a scholarship for you to attend a special program. It's a school that focuses on helping kids like you, kids who have been through tough situations but have the potential to do great things. You'd get the education you need, but also training in leadership, problem solving, and life skills. It's an opportunity for you to really grow, to prepare for the future in ways you never thought possible." Ethan was stunned. A scholarship? A special program? He had never imagined that something like this would be within his reach. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his mind racing to process the information. "You don't have to decide right now," Oliver said gently. "But I wanted to let you know that the opportunity is there. You've already proven that you're capable of so much, Ethan. This is just the next step." Ethan sat in silence for a few moments, his thoughts swirling. The idea of leaving the center, of stepping into an entirely new world, was both thrilling and terrifying. He had grown used to the stability the center provided, and the thought of leaving Jake and Max behind, even if it was for something positive, filled him with hesitation. "What about Jake and Max?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. "I can't just leave them." Oliver smiled, as if he had expected the question. "Jake and Max will be taken care of. The center is still their home, and they'll continue to have everything they need here. You won't be abandoning them, Ethan. In fact, by taking this opportunity, you'll be setting an example for them. You'll be showing them that no matter where you come from, you can always strive for more." Ethan nodded slowly, still uncertain but beginning to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about paving the way for a better life for all of them. If he succeeded, Jake and Max would know that they could too. The thought of inspiring his brothers gave him strength, but the fear of failure still lingered. "I'll think about it," Ethan finally said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "That's all I ask," Oliver replied with a warm smile. "Take your time. This is a big decision, and I want you to feel confident about it." Over the next few days, Ethan found himself lost in thought more often than not. The idea of going to a new school, of having a chance to build something more for himself, was tempting. But with that opportunity came a mountain of self-doubt. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't handle the pressure? What if he failed and everything fell apart? Despite these fears, the conversations he had with Jake and Max kept him grounded. They were excited for him, even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. To them, Ethan was a hero, someone who had always taken care of them no matter what. And now, they believed he could do anything. Their faith in him was unwavering, and it gave Ethan the courage to seriously consider Oliver's offer. One evening, as they sat together before bed, Jake looked up at Ethan with wide eyes. "Are you really going to go to a new school?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Maybe," he said softly. "I haven't decided yet." "I think you should," Max chimed in, his quiet voice full of certainty. "You're smart, Ethan. You could be anything you want." Hearing those words from his brothers made something click inside Ethan. They believed in him. Why couldn't he believe in himself? Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start embracing the opportunities in front of him. Maybe it was time to take the lead. The next morning, Ethan sought out Oliver, his decision made. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady but determined. "I'll take the scholarship." Oliver's face broke into a wide smile. "That's fantastic news, Ethan. I'm proud of you. This is going to be the start of something incredible." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The center helped Ethan get everything he needed for the new school, from clothes to school supplies. The closer the day of his departure came, the more real it felt. And with that reality came a mixture of excitement and fear. But as each day passed, the fear began to fade, replaced by the knowledge that he was taking control of his future in a way he had never thought possible. On the morning of his departure, the staff at the center gathered to see him off. Jake and Max hugged him tightly, their eyes filled with both pride and sadness. "We'll miss you," Jake said, his voice small. "I'll miss you too," Ethan replied, his heart heavy. "But I'll come back. I promise." As the car pulled away from the center, Ethan looked out the window, watching as the place that had become his home disappeared from view. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next. The new school was everything Oliver had promised and more. The curriculum was challenging, but Ethan rose to the occasion, determined to prove that he belonged there. He made new friends, learned new skills, and began to see himself not just as a survivor, but as someone with the potential to succeed. The experience was transformative, and it wasn't long before Ethan started to dream bigger than he ever had before. Years later, as he stood in front of a crowd, delivering a speech at his graduation, Ethan couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought him here. From the cold streets to the safety of the center, to the opportunities that had changed his life, it had been a long and difficult road. But he had made it. Looking out into the audience, he spotted Oliver, Jake, and Max, all beaming with pride. In that moment, Ethan realized that everything he had done, every hardship he had endured, had been worth it. He wasn't just a street kid anymore. He was a leader, a brother, and most importantly, someone who believed in his own potential. As the crowd applauded, Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment he had never known before. The future was wide open, and he was ready for whatever it had in store. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.